Hello, everyone, and welcome to our podcast. Today we have the pleasure of talking with Matt Barone, and he is a geometry instructor online. He has a lot of experience with obviously with geometry, but he is also certified in math up to grade 12. He has a degree in economics, a minor in mathematics, a master's in business and global leadership, and moreover, he's a geometry enthusiast. And so I think that's what brought him uh, here today. And I'd like to discuss geometry in its mathematical aspect as well as its sacred aspect. And I just wanted to welcome you to the podcast.
Thanks, Scott. It's great to be here. Yeah, I mean, I've been a big fan of the show here. Listened to all the episodes, so it's really an honor to be here.
So, how did you discover the sacred aspect of geometry?
So I actually did discover it right away. I had been a math instructor in a traditional brick and mortar school for a few years, and always just had a curiosity about things that were, kind of out of the norm, things that were on the fringe. Um, I just had an aptitude for that, and I always looked towards things like that. And I discovered it through just through a YouTube channel, and it really opened up my world a little bit because I had been teaching standard Euclidean geometry in the classroom. And when I kind of found this, I was like, wow, this is so exciting and interesting. And this applies some of what I know and some of what I teach, but it kind of takes it to another level. And it adds, philosophy into it and numerology and metrology, and it applies it to all these actual structures that are around the world, and it applies it to art. And then my mind was just kind of going as I absorbed more and more. I started to develop these ideas and these philosophies around what was going on here as far as life goes. And I think anybody that starts to dig into these concepts, I think you start to change a little bit. Because like I've heard you say before, it does reach, geometry is unique in that it kind of reaches deep into your psyche, and it resonates. And so that was kind of my journey, my introduction to sacred geometry.
I had a similar trajectory, maybe going through high school and learning geometry and then the non-visual aspects of math like algebra and pre-calculus and calculus. I
Mm-hmm.
remember loving geometry most of all, maybe because of the visual aspect. But I didn't know about the sacred aspect of geometry for many years. It wasn't taught in the curriculum. Is that something that you find that you're not allowed to teach that aspect, or do you kind of sneak it in wherever you can?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question because I've actually begun creating a curriculum for a modified Euclidean geometry course where it injects many of these concepts of sacred geometry into it. Um, I'm just in like the pre-planning stages. I've gotten most of it right now, but I'm going to be presenting it to some coworkers just to kind of get their feedback on it. But to answer your question, I do interject it a little bit into my standard geometry classes. And in the format that we teach online, a lot of it is automatically graded assignments, but we have interactions with the students all the time where they're required to have phone calls with us at the end of each chapter to do a knowledge check. And one of the things that I always stress to them is when we work with the compass and the straight edge, which unfortunately we don't do all that much of. But when we get to that point, I try to tell them, like, can be a meditative practice. This can be something that it can be really beneficial to you more than just taking a test. And so, it's one of the more fun things we do. And, I think it's good if you guys really kind of dig into what we're doing here. And so I'll interject a little bit here and there. I mean, I have to stick mostly to the curriculum. But when I see opportunities to interweave some of those teachings, yeah, I take advantage of that because I think it's important.
I remember reading in Keith Critchlow's Sacred Geometry of Flowers book that he called the drafting compass the world's oldest scientific instrument. And I love that. It's true that the mathematical use of geometry is the oldest one of all, in that it comes right to the very beginning of recorded history. And
Yeah.
and all civilizations have had some form of geometry.
Yeah.
Essential to that would be the straight edge and the compass.
Yeah.
But I think that that's just one of what I see as three different branches of geometry, and they're not at all evident. Like when you go into your high school geometry class and you learn that it's focusing on one aspect of geometry, which is the kind that you can get to logically by using your left brain and focusing in and unpacking all of that knowledge from the relationship of triangles, let's say, or all of the relationships of a circle. You have all the sine and cosine and tangent and all the trigonometric functions come out of the relationship of a circle and its radius, and breaking that down into triangles. So it's very focused, and a lot of people don't like that aspect, I guess. Would you say? Have you experienced that?
Yes, I'm going on year 15 now. Part of that was in the classroom, but the majority of that has been online. And I have a lot of interaction with students and even parents that will express, a lot of hesitancy of trying to absorb this information. It's very difficult. Math isn't their favorite subject, which is another motivator for me to kind of look at the sacred geometry aspect and interject it, because I think this is very interesting. And I think that it can be a hook to try and capture students' imaginations and let them know that, hey, this is more than just these axioms and these postulates that we're discovering here. There's a much bigger world to this that's applicable to you personally. So yeah, I agree with that 100%.
I think that the sacred aspect of geometry reaches more to the heart or to the soul of the person. And that's a very different aspect than reaching your left brain.
Absolutely.
And so I think that by involving the so-called sacred aspect, it doesn't have to be religious in any way, but we use the term sacred because it has a exquisiteness to it, a beauty to it. And when you hook someone on that, maybe they become more interested to expend the effort to structure their left brain in such a way that they can absorb the theorems and postulates and axioms and so on, because it's work. And I recently kind of recapitulated my whole mathematical education, because I went back to Khan Academy and I started from like algebra 1 with the basics, and I did all the geometry, algebra 2, pre-calculus, calculus, all the way to calculus BC. And it was like climbing a mountain. And it took me about 6 weeks of really intense effort. And I guess you might say I'm crazy because I enjoy that sometimes. Like I took on the challenge to see if I could attain what I used to know.
Mhm.
Now that I'm middle-aged, am I as smart as I once was? And I found that it was really harder than I remember learning, but I feel like I understand it a lot better now than I did when I was a teenager. And
Yeah.
it's well worth the effort. But that kind of activity is just 100% like effort, because it's structuring your brain. And that most people don't want. And it's a tragedy, I think, because if you look at history, Euclid's Elements, Euclid of Alexandria lived about 2,000 years ago, and he wrote down all of the common geometry ideas of the ancient world in a single, really efficiently written text. And that book was the most published book in the West after the Bible for about 2,000 years, up until the beginning of the 20th century, I would say. And I don't know what it was that stopped people from studying Euclid directly from the source text, but it might have been the introduction of radio and later television. these kind
Yeah,
of
I was gonna say
distractions get you away from
yes.
learning like Latin and Greek, and I feel like some of the people that in the 19th century were so smart because if they were fortunate enough to have the luxury of an education, that is,
Hmm.
they really had to push themselves to learn this stuff. And I was just reading an article yesterday in the New York Times about Yale, and what is it, 80, I think it's 82%, something like that, of the students at Yale get an A or an A minus. And it kind of alarms me, like what is that? How come you can't just find out how well you did for real? You just get
Right.
an A for participation now. Do
Right.
you find that is there pressure on you as a geometry instructor to give everyone an A?
I don't find pressure to give everyone an A. But to go back to some earlier points you made about the distractions and where we've kind of come, you know, I see what you were saying as how, the Euclidean geometry book was probably one of the most popular books there for 2000 years. But then you brought up radio and these other distractions that take place. And of course, we live in a world now where that hasn't slowed down. I mean, that is ramped up to the next level. And so there are all of these distractions there. And it's really a shame because we live in an amazing time where anything you want to know, anything you want to learn is in your pocket, really, with your cell phone or on a computer. And so, um, you know, I don't feel pressure to give students A's, but to also tether in the hard work aspect, that is something that I think is lost because Euclidean geometry is work, like you said. It's very left brain. You have to study, and then we kind of get students get very distracted with that, and they get very discouraged with that, which is another reason why I think interjecting some sort of meditative geometry into it is beneficial. And we can go down that route in a later conversation, but I think there's some definite benefits to drawing out some creative mandalas and doing Metatron's cube with a compass and straight edge. I think Carl Jung even said that, and we can get into that later. But to answer your question, yeah, it's a distraction these days. Yes.
Yeah, and I think we're increasingly distracted such that people have lost sight of what it means to focus on something for 8 hours straight. You know what I mean? Like totally focus on something all day long. And when you have that kind of activity, um, you you make breakthroughs, you go places, you get things done
Yes.
in a way that you can never do when you're getting notifications on your phone and you're always just distracted, so that your work is at a very superficial level. And I think
Yeah.
that geometry is a wonderful tool in this aspect because it does unpack from the first axioms, like a point. What's a point? What is a line? What is a plane? And from those things flow outward all of this logical edifice that unpacks in the mind and allows you to have construct kind of clear thinking
Hmm.
that I think is really important. And at the end of the day, I don't think the geometry or the math is the important thing. I think it's like a pathway up the mountain. And the important thing is getting yourself up that mountain.
Right.
When you get there, then you can use that kind of feeling of accomplishment and clear thinking that you've learned in every aspect of life, not
Yeah.
just math.
No, and you need that for life. And to go back to what you were saying about breakthroughs, yeah, I mean, practice and study is sometimes not always the most fun thing. What the fun thing that happens is after you've put in the time, and then you get those aha moments. But people want that automatically. And unfortunately, that doesn't come unless you're willing to put in, some time and some effort. It's like building a muscle in your body. It's not just going to get big on its own. It has to be put under some stress. But what the beautiful thing is what happens afterwards. It's those thoughts that come into your mind. You're like, oh my gosh, I've discovered this. And I think that's extremely important and healthy for human beings and the mind.
Exactly. And it's like, I think of it as a metaphor would be like bodybuilding. And I have
Hmm.
a lot of respect for Arnold Schwarzenegger
Hmm.
because he started out with the goal in mind to become the world's strongest man, you know, which seems like an absurd goal. I mean, do you know how many strong people there are? It's crazy. And he achieved that goal and became like Mr. Universe so many times that, and this happened like 50 years ago, you know?
Right.
And then he went on to reinvent himself and become a millionaire and then become an actor and then become the governor of California. And that is a person who has really mastered the art of climbing the mountain. And I think
Yeah.
that geometry can actually teach you not the build bodybuilding or any of the other stuff, but it can give you a sense of accomplishment that you've done something and achieved something. And then you
Hmm.
can form those pathways in your mind and then reuse them in another area, you know? Um,
Yes, that's applicable. Like
yeah,
you said, to all areas of life. Accomplishing something. The first time you do anything, the first time you read a book from finish to end, the first time you shoot a basketball, or you draw a mandala, whatever it is, whenever you've accomplished something that's hard. And I think that's a key word there. It's got to be hard, in my opinion, so that you have this sense of accomplishment. Um,
yeah.
and
That's what it's about. I don't think it's about the actual data that you can get from geometry. Like you can Google whatever theorem you want and get it right away, but
Right.
the point is structuring your mind. It's like building your body.
Hmm.
The point is doing the exercise, and then the
Hmm.
rewards come from that. And
Right.
and then what's amazing to me is geometry isn't just this workout machine, but that's only one aspect of three.
Right. Would you call that the quantitative aspect of it?
No, I would call what we just discussed the mathematical aspect. It's like
Okay.
abstraction.
Okay.
It's like it's like it exists like in another domain, a platonic realm where the geometry exists. Because in a sense, there isn't a triangle in the world. A triangle is three lines connected at points, and a line is length without breadth. And you can't
Right.
have length without breadth in the world because
Hmm.
everything has to be made out of something that has a finite size.
Hmm.
So what's amazing is geometry doesn't even exist in the material world. It exists
Hmm.
purely in the mind. And in that
Hmm.
regard, it's an abstraction.
Hmm.
But I would say that quantitative would be the use of geometry as it's applied in the world. So architecture and engineering, for example, which is what I happened to study in university and professionally,
So
was
these
using the
physical
quantitative
manifestations.
aspect of it, of geometry day to day to design buildings.
Hmm.
So it's very useful. Like you couldn't imagine designing a commercial building if you couldn't use any geometry and you couldn't make any drawings. How are you going to do it?
Right.
You know, there's no way around it. You've got to use geometry to get the job done. And all
Hmm.
of that geometrical know-how is built into the tools that we use. It used to be pencil and paper, but now it's all like CAD and BIM and 3D modeling.
Hmm.
But it's all built into those tools. And so when you're using those tools, you don't have to know the math. You just use the math as a tool. So
Hmm.
it's a different aspect of geometry. It's not about knowing in that kind of rational way. It's about practical manipulation of the geometric tools to get a practical job done to improve our lives.
Right.
And so there's careers that can be built using those tools in so many different ways. And even in like graphic design, web design, all these things, encoding, all these things use some kind of visual aspect that's ultimately based on geometry. It underlies so much. But then there's this other hidden dimension of geometry that you happen to stumble upon, which is the part that reaches your heart and your soul. And it's transmitted more through the beauty channel, I think, of
Hmm.
of of meditating on the geometry and and realizing its exquisiteness, its perfection, its purity, its I don't know. There's some ineffable aspect to it that makes it hard to discuss.
Yes.
But it's the third leg of the tripod of what geometry has in its essence, you know. And I see geometry as like a civilization building kit, you know, because you just need to unpack it in different ways, and it just
That's a very interesting way of putting it, a civilization building kit, that I think people have in them intuitively, but also can learn from it. And, you know, something you and I have talked about before, when you have this and you start to emulate the world around you, the natural world I'm speaking of, and you're building that into your architecture. It's a very convenient way and an effective way to build a world that will touch, like you said, your heart and the deepest parts of your psyche, that I think really affect people in positive ways. It's like when somebody goes to see a beautiful painting by Leonardo da Vinci, or a beautiful architecture. It speaks to people in ways that they might not fully understand. But when that left brain starts to analyze exactly what it is we're looking at here and taking the measurements and saying, oh, look, here's a golden rectangle here. Oh, look at this, look at this, look at this phi ratio we have here. They've incorporated and encoded, you know, the Euler number or pi. And so we can start to break down exactly why that makes us feel the way it does. And then it's almost like you're discovering a little roadmap, into why these things work. And so you can get into the question, you know, well, maybe not the question, but an interesting thought is, you know, what's more important, or what's really going on here? Is this stuff happening intuitively, or were they really measuring this out? Those are things I kind of ponder all the time, and I think it might be a little bit of both. But
I think it's unique in that when you see a beautiful painting or a sculpture that uses geometry somehow, you don't have to know that at all. You feel it, and it comes right into your soul, and then when it resonates with you, you go, "That's so beautiful." And I think that knowing about it is a separate activity. Knowing about it adds another layer of appreciation potentially, for your left brain to be happy about it. You know, it's like, oh, you get the scientific aspect of it, and you're like, oh, that's really cool. But the real thing that touches people is emotion, and knowing why is kind of trivia. I love the trivia, so I'm a person who wants to do that, but it doesn't, I'd say that most people aren't interested in that. Most people are just moved by the geometry that's manipulating kind of the archetypes within them. And they don't, I think if you become like a magician, you become skilled in manipulating those archetypes, because you know that's what reaches people. In designing the corporate logo, or the proportions of the credit card, or the proportions of the vinyl sticker on the LP album, or the length of the piano keys on the keyboard. These are the things that, when they're done right, they just work, they resonate, and people don't need to know. And it just works. It's like, if you have to explain it, it's not working.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm a person who likes to explain it and likes to know and wants to figure out, because I want to be like the magician who is consciously using these things and playing in that realm.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I like to figure things out, and once I kind of figure out what the tool is, then I want to play with that tool, because I think that's fun. That's part of life, is figuring something out and then having fun with it. And you know this as well as anybody, figuring this out is not easy. There is a lot that goes into it. And I think we had a conversation about this towards the end of our last conversation, but it's not something you're going to get in a weekend retreat. It's a lifelong pursuit, and maybe multi-generational, because there's a lot to unpack here. But what a fun way to explore the world that you're actually living in, and not just your world, but the world beyond this world. Really, I mean, this stuff goes beyond the planet Earth. It goes into the solar system, and you can look into the galaxy, the way the galaxies spiral.
Or even down to the structure of the atom.
And then you can go down to the micro, all the way down to the structure of the atom. So it's everywhere, and I think it's endlessly fascinating. And it's one of the reasons I think I have a very curious mind, and when I start to pull on a thread that intrigues me, I really kind of go all in, and I try to figure things out. So this has been a super fun pursuit for me. I really enjoy it.
Let me ask you a question on what your take is on whether geometry is invented or discovered. What is your opinion on that?
Ooh, that's a big question, and my first reaction would probably be that it's being discovered, because these things are there. You can see how it manifests in nature, and so I think it's there for us to discover, and then we sort of wrap the structure of our minds around what we're seeing. And so, like, for example, if you look at certain crystals form themselves in platonic solids, or certain viruses form themselves in icosahedrons. And so that structure is there. And then it's up for us to measure it and use the tools available to us to understand that. So in a way, I think it's a discovery, but we're also inventing the tools and the measurements to analyze those things. So maybe it's a little bit of both, but the geometry is there, I think this is probably a more existential question, whether we exist or not, I think it's going to be there. So, yeah.
I think so. I agree with you in that it's mostly discovered, but we do play a part in inventing things with those things that are already there and remixing them. Mm-hmm. And if we were to meet an alien in a spaceship that landed on, and they didn't speak English and they didn't even look like us, and it wasn't Star Trek, they didn't just have a cosmetic nose and ears and spoke English, we would probably use geometry or music to try to communicate with them.
Yes, I've had these same thoughts.
Yeah, and why would we do that? Why would we use geometry or music? It's like, are we torturing them with high school subjects or something here? No, it's because those are universals that are presumably the same everywhere in the universe. So we ought to be able to establish some kind of line of communication.
Yes.
Using
and to parse that out maybe a little bit more, like I like to get into the nitty gritty of things. So like when you think about language, right? And so language is just an expression of thought and emotion. And so that's going to manifest itself in an infinite number of different ways throughout the universe. And so if you can imagine another civilization in another star system, their form of communication might not even use vocal cords. It might use something completely different. Some sort of symbology, but assuming they live in a three-dimensional space, their form of geometry would have similarities to ours, and that would be the universal language. So I've always been fascinated with language. I speak 2 languages, and I've always felt that learning 2 languages reorders your mind in a way, and restructures the brain in a very healthy way, because how you speak is how you think in different languages. And where you grow up and what language you speak really kind of affects the way that you think. But one thing that is constant, I think, throughout the universe would be the language of geometry. So if you were going to speak to another race that has a far different way of communication, that would be a common thread.
I agree. But I think that we have a lot of work to do to become fluent in that language.
Oh, yes.
Because, for example, crop circle designs. Crop circles have been happening for decades, if not hundreds of years, and their designs became much more elaborate within our lifetimes. And if geometry is a language, what are these designs saying? And let's, it doesn't really matter to me if the artist of the crop circle was some guy in London who has an art project, but I'm interested in, what does that say? What does that, how do we decode that? And I haven't gotten very far on that road. I know that like John Michel and Robin Heath have written some books on these things, and there's a few exemplar crop circles that really they've unpacked, but mostly I'm just able to apprehend them more on a sacred geometry level of meditating on it and feeling into it.
Yes.
I would love it if we could unpack the left brain side so that we could actually decode the message. But I feel like it's a little bit like hieroglyphs before the Rosetta Stone, you know, where
How would you know what anything
we
said
don't,
without the Rosetta
we
Stone?
can't figure out what they say, you know. What's your take on crop circles?
Well, first of all, I think that would be the most fun job in the world to have. Like if your job was to decode crop circles. I mean, if there's someone out there that's hired for that job, let me know, because that would be amazing.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
I want to be a candidate also. So
yeah, because I mean, wow. Yeah, I mean, I think that if I mean, we don't have to talk about who we think is making them or anything like that, but I agree with you that the geometry within there is critical to understand, because there are some elaborate designs. We know they're geometric in nature. We can see squared circles. We can see star tetrahedrons, um, circles, and it is a form of communication. I would love to know just more about it. I'm in my beginning stages of doing a deep dive into crop circles. Um, but to really understand what they're saying is, I think it takes a tremendous amount of time and maybe several brains working on it simultaneously to try and decode the information that's appearing there, in a very mysterious nature, I might add.
and
So yeah.
it's kind of episodic in that each circle is its own complete story. But
Yeah.
sometimes you'll find there's a theme, and the same kind of looking theme will appear next year, and it will
Yes.
be a little bit different. And so you start to see that maybe there's seasons that where there's a communication that's taking place over time. And in some rare cases, crop circles will, on the same season, part of it will appear, and then like 3 days later, more of it will appear.
Yes. And
And
you
it's
just
like
sparked something in
staged.
my. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I didn't mean to
No,
interrupt.
that's all. It's just kind of phased or staged in that way sometimes.
Yeah, and not only is it a very clever way of communicating, whether no matter what you believe where it comes from, but the symbols themselves can tell an entire story. Sometimes I think we look at a symbol like that, like, oh, that's just a symbol for one thing. Where in actuality, when you start to decode it and break it down, this can be an entire concept that has multiple facets within it, that has a lot of information to unpack within within an elaborate design. Um, and so that's another reasons why I would hope that there are high level academics working on it. I know that John Michel and Robin Heath did work on it, but yeah, what an interesting way to spend your time trying to decode something that's so elaborate and interesting to get information
I feel
and
like
have.
almost like a higher dimensional or higher level form of communication, because
Mhm.
these designs can be so unpacked, and this geometry, you could write like whole books about it, potentially in a
Mhm.
particular crop circle. And I feel like we are, as a civilization, illiterate.
Mhm.
We're almost like in the Middle Ages, they had a bar that had a rat and a raven on the sign, and they didn't, because people didn't know how to read. So they're like, I'll go to the rat and raven, you know. But we have to learn how to read the language, to
Mhm.
decode it, and to understand more deeply on the with the kind of left brain cognition about
Mhm.
what does it mean. And it doesn't, you don't need that. It's just like we were talking earlier, that if you have to explain it, it isn't working.
Mhm.
There's something about it that just reaches right into you.
Mhm.
And that for me is undeniable. But I still, I want to know, I want to be able to talk about it. I want to be able to unpack it. You know?
Yes, because I think there's a story to tell there in each one. Um, no matter who makes it, I think there is a story there to be told, and I think you have to unpack it. I think you have to analyze it. I think you have to draw them over again yourself and use a compass and straight edge and use GeoGebra and really analyze it to see what information is there. Um, and then why at a certain time would it appear? And then why the following year, somewhere nearby, something else take place. I mean, though I think the locations of where they pop up is also very interesting.
Mhm.
In south of England, there seems to be a super high concentration, although they do appear around the world. Um,
Yeah,
but
and
yeah, I think there's
why are
there's
they
a lot.
concentrated there? Is it just a cultural thing, or
I
is
mean,
it
that's
like an acupuncture point of the earth? You know,
right,
and also
right.
why is it correlated with the ancient monuments that are there? I see behind you that you have some of the regular polyhedra sacred
Yes.
geometries. You have Metatron's cube, you have
Mhm.
the nested icosahedrons there, you
Mhm.
have tetrahedrons. And I'm
Mhm.
fascinated by those three-dimensional forms, because
Yeah.
it takes the Euclidean geometry up to a higher level, and it requires more visualization power in the mind to
Mhm.
think about that. And why are there only five regular polyhedra?
Very interesting.
And why are there 13 Archimedean solids? You know, what's up with that? And yeah, I
I,
find that fascinating. There's like these archetypes of number that emerge out of the possibilities in three-dimensional space. And then if you look at the fourth dimension, if you look at a tesseract,
Mhm.
if you Wikipedia that, there's a cool video I've seen of a tesseract that's turning, and it's in three-dimensional projection, which means
Uh,
that this four-dimensional object, it's like a cube in four dimensions that's being slowly turned.
I've seen that.
And in three-dimensional projection, which is dumbing it down a level, it
Mhm.
looks like this cube's inside is becoming the outside, and the outside is becoming the inside. And
And
it's
we see the shadow.
and it's like really hard, like it goes beyond us to be able to visualize the actual form of that. And it is like like you said, the shadow in Plato's cave. Like
Mhm.
we can only really see the shadows. We can, that's as close as we can get in a way to visualizing the tesseract, is by looking at its shadows. And depending on how you turn the tesseract, it can look more like an octagonal pattern. I've seen
Mhm.
it can look more like a cube within a cube, like a hexagonal pattern. It
Mhm.
depends on how that projection is, how you're looking at it. And so
Mhm.
these geometric forms exist in a more comprehensive, vaster scope in a higher dimensional space. And I
Mhm.
feel like crop circles might be like that. And what we're seeing in the field is really just a cross section in two dimensions of a higher dimensional form. But some of that dimensionality is carried through into the way that the crops are swirled or tied up in little knots, and there's additional information that's conveyed through the laying down of the crop. Um, but still it's a great simplification of something that's much more complex, I feel. And
Yes.
and so I feel like the pursuit of geometry is kind of like we're I'm you and I are prisoners in that cave, chained up and looking at the shadows on the wall, and we're both trying to get a glimpse of the
Mhm.
actual reality. And we're unusual in that most prisoners are they don't even know their shadows that they're looking at, and they don't even care. But for
Yeah.
some reason, I really want to see what's outside of the cave, and it sounds like you do too. And we're
Mhm.
striving to like do that, you know. Um, and I think geometry is a way of I don't. It's a road
Mhm.
in that
It's a
pursuit.
path you can go.
Yeah.
It's a
Um,
path you can go to start to peek out of that cave. And then, and then the funny thing is, or the interesting thing is once you kind of go out of that cave and you go back and you try to have conversations with people that are still in that cave, it can be very difficult to explain what you've seen because it's almost like you have to experience it for yourself um, in order to convey that information.
I
But
think that is
I
true, though. It is a individual journey that you have to
Mhm.
go on.
Yeah, can only show them the way. They have to kind of walk it, sort of a thing. But I enjoy the journey. I enjoy walking it. Um, I love self-discovery. Um, but yeah, I think geometry is just an efficient vehicle to kind of get there and show you things um, that you might not be able to see. And we know mathematics and physics, and these are ways of looking at things that maybe with our senses we're not able to see, but through mathematics and observation of effects, we can start to surmise the way reality is. Um, and so geometry and these high level mathematics and physics are efficient vehicles for getting there. But geometry is unique because it also touches something deep inside your heart, like you said, and resonates with you. That's difficult to put into words. But I often thought that the branding of sacred geometry could use a rebranding. Sometimes when you say the word sacred geometry, I can feel people's eyes start to glaze over a little bit. Um, I would I would maybe rebrand it as like an intuitive geometry, something that's it's there. It encapsulates all the traditional abstract and quantitative geometry, but then that qualitative geometry that touches deep inside is that elusive part that's so fascinating, I think, to most people that get involved and discover this.
Yeah, I agree. Geometry has bad branding, you know,
Right.
because most people just see the maybe the mathematical aspect,
Hmm.
or they might consider, oh yeah, there's a practical aspect, of course, too. Like if you want to have a blueprint of anything, you need geometry for that.
Hmm.
But they overlook the kind of aspect where it can reach within. I mean, obviously, it makes blueprints in the world, and science uses geometry to study the structure of the atom and so on, and the structure of the large scale structure of the universe.
Hmm.
Um, so it's used outside. It's the path of science, but it's
Hmm.
also the path of the mystic to go within. And
Hmm.
how there's no other subject that
There's
it
nothing else
works in
like it.
both ways. You know, it's pretty amazing when you if you think about that. Um, it's the connective tissue between the outside and the inside. And in fact, maybe the whole universe is a mathematical construct. And what happens with geometry is when you go down this road, don't you feel like it invites you on a journey of self-exploration, on a philosophical journey of a kind of questioning your reality, questioning what is life about? All of these things come into play, for at least they have for me, in exploring the deeper aspects of geometry. Have you would you resonate
Yes.
with what I'm saying there?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, because when you start to discover some of this, some of these repetitive patterns, and you start to see the connections between life and life beyond, and then the universal nature of things, you start to wonder, hey, like what is going on here? And that eventually starts to lead you to ask some very big questions, about who you are and what is this all about, and what am I, who am I really? And so these become huge questions that geometry helps you to start to ask, because I think it's important that we ask those questions and have deep conversations like this. I think it's super healthy for humans to do that. Just like it's super healthy to eat good and to exercise. To have conversations and to ask big questions is the only way you're ever going to get big answers. So yeah, it does. It resonates with me. Absolutely.
It leads to more and more questions and in an iterative process of refinement.
Which is good, I think.
So I think that's the nature of a journey. You go on a journey, you don't know where you're going, but you make decisions along the way, and you keep tracking in different ways and following your interest. And eventually you go very, very deeply within, or you study the world outside and you go very, very deeply outside. And you kind of, I think, come around to the same destination no matter which path you take, which is in consciousness, because geometry is a language. And if it's a subject that transcends all human cultures throughout history, and yet geometry isn't in the world, then where is it? How do we know? How can we all agree on this thing? We can't even agree on almost anything. But how is it that all human cultures can agree on this thing that we call geometry? I think in a way that's very reassuring, and perhaps a touchstone for coming together is using this thing that we all have in common to come together on this project, you see? Because it's a kind of road to truth with a capital T, an absolute truth that exists, because that's how the universe is made, out of this truth. You don't have to have it's just something that,
well, I think
unique.
when everybody can get together and agree on something, then I think you're starting to knock on the door of truth. And so I think everyone would agree that the geometry is all there. And so I think that's a good baseline for understanding the world that we all inhabit. And I'm a firm believer that I'm a firm believer that that's why the ancients were constructing these structures, either encoding these ancient numbers and these golden rectangles and these ancient canon of metrology into their structures, because they were either doing it intuitively or they were consciously thinking of it. But they were doing that to emulate the world around them, because they all recognized that this is the way, this is an order of things. And why not emulate the world that we're living in, with our architecture?
And don't you think that's
clear?
That's a natural process, a
Natural progression,
wholesomely good activity to build your temple in resonance with the universe?
Yes.
I mean, it's not some kind of Illuminati agenda here. It's just
makes sense
with the natural elements to build something that resonates as above, so below. And then you feel like you're part of it. You feel like you're interconnected with all that is through this geometric resonance that can be set up by kind of skillful practitioners or magicians, architects, engineers who use these principles. I think all too often today we have forgotten that, and the things that we build just don't resonate with that, and they're just purely practical enclosures.
Well, we've gotten away, and I think we've become a little bit too married to materialism. And when that extrapolates over time, you start to look at profit and loss in the balance sheet, and so
that's important.
That's important, but it often becomes a bit toxic and dictates the ultimate decision making. And so, I mean, I get it, but like you said, I mean, these structures they're undeniably beautiful, and they resonate within human beings in a way that I do think we've lost a tiny bit. So it's interesting to study them. It's interesting to go down those avenues of exploration and see where we were and where we're going. I think that we've lost a lot over the years. And when I say over the years, I mean going way, way back, because I think there's been natural disasters that have reset the clock, so to speak. And we find some of these ancient sites that may be remnants of a very, very old time when there was a civilization that may have reached a higher level than we are now, but didn't go the way that we've gone, didn't go by the way of the combustible engine, didn't go by the way of the Industrial Revolution, and didn't go so heavily on technology. They may have gone another way.
But they might have understood things more comprehensively.
And they may have understood things more comprehensively.
Yeah.
And maybe their starting point was a little bit different. And so they went a different way, and they lived a certain way. And then, these catastrophes have been cataloged now. We know they go back, and they're cyclical in nature. And so if you give a civilization, a couple thousand more extra years, I mean, how far are they going to get to? I mean, look at us now. I mean, look where we're at right now. Give us another 1,000 years. I mean, I think most people would say another 1,000 years, we're going to be in the stars somewhere. We're going to leave the planet and at least start to attempt to colonize other worlds. I mean, that's happening now.
Well, it seems like we have different possible outcomes. We could be Neolithic again very easily, or we could be a interstellar civilization in 1,000 years, and both are possibilities depending on, in some regard, of what happens to our civilization, and also chance,
right,
and can come into play. Yeah.
But if you look back and you think that maybe a group of humans that are anatomically similar to us, if you gave them 10, 20, 30,000 years of uninterrupted progress, no giant cataclysms that reset the clock, of course, where would they have gotten to? Well, they may have gone. Yeah. Of course, where would they have gotten to? They may have come and gone past certain ages of technology and then gone back. I mean, it's impossible to know. It's fun to think about, but something was going on where they definitely reached a high level of sophistication, and that's apparent in the architecture that's left behind.
And Plato, who we look to for the allegory of the cave and so much wisdom about his teacher Socrates, talked about Atlantis as a previous civilization, and he heard about it from his ancestor Solon, who went to ancient Egypt and learned about this from the priests. And they remembered 5 floods, and the Greeks only remembered 1. And the Egyptian history went way, way back. And if you, like you're saying, if we've been anatomically modern humans for, let's say, minimum 200,000, maximum 300,000 years, and we've only we've had civilization for 5,000 years, what were we doing for that 98% of our species history, if we've had the same physical potentials using this physical vehicle of the human body? Were we just sitting around for 98% of the time? I don't buy it.
I often think that people underestimate the brain power of human beings. There are some extraordinarily smart human beings stomping around on the planet now. And I mean, you're just never going to convince me that similar anatomically humans 20,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, didn't occasionally birth a human with incredible mental capabilities to think and understand and to promote ideas and to carry a civilization. You're going to have groups of those people within the genetics. They're going to happen.
Have you come across these spherical stones that are about handheld size? I think it was in Skara Brae in northern UK, uh,
Hmm.
where they have grooves on them in kind of like great circles, and the grooves are arranged in such a way that they represent the five Platonic solids.
Oh, wow. What are they called?
I don't know what they're called, but I know that they have been found. I've seen pictures, and
I'll have to.
they're like, I don't know if they're Mesolithic or Neolithic. They're super old. And this is evidence that people understood the five Platonic solids back then, which is something that,
Incredible.
like Leonardo da Vinci was the first person in Western history to depict a dodecahedron. And that was in about 500 years ago. We're talking about stones that are, I don't know, 5,000 years old, something like that.
Hmm.
So people have known this. It wasn't that we just discovered it. That's the wonderful thing about geometry is it can be forgotten and
Mm.
then unpacked again and rediscovered because it's already there. And
Mm.
we just need to unpack it and build a civilization. And I think it's the key to doing that.
Mm.
Geometry is. It's like this civilization building package that when you start with the first principles, you can construct an edifice of mathematics and logic and architecture and engineering, and you can rebuild a technological civilization from going down that rabbit hole.
It's always there to be rediscovered.
Yeah.
As
And I
long as
feel like
humans are there to
we
rediscover.
are not at the end of that. We're at the beginning, actually.
Hmm.
And there's much more to do in and becoming literate in this language, and I think it's really exciting if you look at it in the right light. It's actually really encouraging, and um, I would I would love to hear more about how you figure out how to kind of switch on your students' minds and get them excited about mathematics and geometry, um, through a little bit of in, intuitional geometry or whatever, that you want to throw into them into their path to
And I do
keep.
notice when I do that, the students, I do notice that I get a bit of more of a enthusiastic reaction when I interject those things. So I suspect, and that's of course that's anecdotal, but I do suspect it could be a way to hook them and to get them excited about something that's bigger than what they might think.
There's some aspect of geometry which is like remembering rather than learning, because you recognize these things that are already there within you, and it has more of an appeal, I think, because it's manipulating the archetypes within, and it's not just somebody giving you knowledge from the outside, but it's helping you connect to this higher realm, or realm of a higher dimensionality within.
Mhm.
And I think that's really exciting. But we're fumbling a little bit in the dark, like prisoners in the cave, trying to figure out how do we do this? How do we really switch the light on for young people who want to learn these things,
Mhm.
um, in a way that doesn't seem like, um, new agey or whatever,
And that's one of the rebranding things that I've thought about. Because I mean, I can tell you, had this been presented to me in such a way in high school, I would have gravitated towards it. Um, and what a great way to stretch a young person's mind and to really get them to think about themselves and to really go inward. And geometry is that amazing vehicle to do that. And I think it's high time that we start interjecting a little bit of this into that to get students excited, to get people excited. Um,
we have to
I think it's
I think
important.
brand it as a kind of call to adventure on the hero's journey. you know, because this can be a lifelong pursuit or many lifetimes pursuit, right? But
Right.
you have to hear that call to adventure, and you have to know there's a possibility even to go on this cool journey. I think that that's fallen flat for most, and they don't even know there's this cool adventure you could go on.
Yeah, I agree. And
Yeah,
I hope that one day that can kind of be interjected into curriculum. And if not, there's always other platforms for people that are curious, that have the aptitude and the appetite to go and learn this stuff and discover it. Which which is a great thing that you and Jeff are doing there with the Sacred Geometry Academy. It's available for people that really want to learn and to go within.
yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
So wonderful. It's
Yeah.
I think we're kind of at time. We've been talking for about an hour now, so I want to thank you
Went
so
by
much
quick.
for coming on the podcast today and discussing our shared passion of geometry in all of its many aspects.
It's been my honor. Like I said, I've been a fan of your show for quite a while now, and any chance I get to speak with someone about geometry and the intricate aspects of it, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much.